All that you see here, the days will come where there will not be left a stone upon another stone that will not be thrown down. In this statement from today's gospel, Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple, the very temple they're looking at. It's a massive structure, which was actually still being completed during Jesus' lifetime. And the temple was at the heart of Jewish faith, temple sacrifice in particular. But the temple was the place where they felt that strong connection with God. Not just felt, but had knowledge of it. But Jesus' prophecy did come to pass. A little over 30 years after the death and resurrection of Christ, in 66 AD, there was a Jewish revolt called the First Jewish Revolt to throw the Romans out of Israel. We hear about some of those things during the life of Christ too. The Roman soldiers were always concerned about some kind of uprising that would take place because it happened occasionally. But this one was somewhat successful, at least at first, in that this Jewish revolt, they were successful in throwing the Roman army out of Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem, a walled city. But in a few short years, the Roman army staged a siege against Jerusalem. Now, siege is a military tactic in battles against walled cities, where in a walled city, usually all the farming and agriculture and food is grown outside, livestock are outside of the walls of the city. But a siege, the enemy surrounds the city, the entire city. So it has to be a big army. And don't let anybody in or anybody out. And eventually they just starve them to death who are in there, or at least weaken them. And it took several months, about 4 to 5 months. And then the Roman army made several forays into the city. But this time, once they conquered the city, it was very bloody. They killed lots of Jewish people and tore down the city, destroyed the city, burned everything they could. And the massive structure of the temple, yes, that was absolutely destroyed as well. And so much, and they were so comprehensive in that not a single stone was left standing on another. I mean, as Christ predicted. In fact, you can go to Jerusalem today, and they have excavated the base around the Temple Mount and in certain parts, and you can see where these massive stones that were quarried to build the temple walls, that those were pushed off. You can see where they were pushed off a great height and then crashed into these stone streets, the paved streets, the Roman streets, and they're caved in. So they were pretty heavy stones. In fact, all that's left of the temple is just one of the retaining walls on the west side. That's why it's called the Western Wall, or sometimes referred to as the Wailing Wall. And that's where anybody can go there, but Jewish people especially, to go and pray and offer prayer intentions there. And it's considered a synagogue in and of itself, just the wall along the wall itself. That event was so cataclysmic, 70 AD is when it was actually destroyed, that it changed the course of Judaism and Christianity. The Jewish faith changed from being centered on temple sacrifice, where priests and high priests would offer sacrifice of animals and crops and livestock as an offering to God, the best of the crops, the best of the livestock, unblemished lambs. So it went from temple sacrifice. Without the temple now, the Judaism became more about rabbinic leadership, the rabbis, based in local synagogues with an emphasis on prayer and the study of the Torah. And in a very broad general sense, this is the direction that Judaism continues. Very many different groupings of Judaism, but still it's more rooted in prayer and study and rabbinical leadership. Christianity changed too. The first Christians, of course, they came out of the Jewish tradition, the apostles. They were all very pious Jews. And they were still centered on Jerusalem. In fact, we read in the Acts of the Apostles, before the temple was destroyed, that the apostles would still go up to the temple and worship there. But after it was destroyed, the Christian movement shifted, and it had already started to move the spread of the gospel beyond Jerusalem through evangelization. But now, after the temple was destroyed, it just spread even further, especially to Gentiles, non-Jews, and it spread to new continents, to Europe, Greece in particular at first, and Africa, and North Africa. And Christianity did not rely on a particular place as being the center of faith. Why? Because Jesus Christ himself is the center of our faith. As Jesus said to his disciples, where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there I am in their midst. And this gathering of the disciples is the church. And it's kept in union through the preaching of the apostles and their successors and the celebration of the sacraments. And in those days, the early versions of the Mass that we're celebrating today. So that's what has led to how we celebrate the faith in our own day. But when Jesus prophesies the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, he wasn't just talking about what's going to happen in 30 years. He's talking also about the destruction of all things, the end of the world, and even the end of our lives is part of that, individually, the end of our lives. It's also pointing to those things. And so it's fitting to ponder these things as we come to the end of the liturgical year. That's why these readings are chosen for this time of year. And it's also fitting that in the month of All Souls, where we remember our beloved departed, whose names are enshrined here, those who we had funerals from our parish, but we remember all our faithful departed in all our hearts. In fact, Father Anthony spoke about this in his homily on All Souls Day. Therefore, I'd like to say a little bit about what our Catholic tradition refers to as the 4 final things. The 4 final things, which are death, judgment, heaven, and hell. Death, judgment, heaven, and hell. And just as the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, which was a worrisome thing, a tragic thing, but it led to the spread of Christianity. It was a catalyst in that regard. So it is the 4 final things, while pondering them doesn't need to be worrisome, but it can lead us to the glorious arms of Christ and to a richer, more profound faith. So death, judgment, heaven, and hell. Death. No one gets out of this world alive, right? We know that. Death in this world is something we all need to face. And sometimes circumstances happen where it might make that a little more obvious, like the death of a loved one. I remember vividly the first time I buried somebody who was my age. And it was a little more rattling that time. Lost a classmate in high school. Things like that. They make you think even more about death. What does that mean? Am I prepared? And death in this world, even though it's a reality that is difficult to face, it's nothing to be feared. It's nothing to be feared. In fact, here's a way to think about it. I'd like to tell you about a man whom I greatly admired. His name was Deacon Loris Bukola. He was the first permanent deacon in the Archdiocese of Portland, and he was also a counselor. In fact, he taught me counseling when I was at seminary. Deacon Loris died in 2006 of ALS, which is also referred to as Lou Gehrig's disease, a fatal illness. There's no cure. When he was first diagnosed, a friend of his called him who had just heard the news. And he called and kind of, this was the nature of the conversation on the phone. He said, I just heard that you have this horrible disease. I hear it's very serious. And Deacon Loris replied, well, it's fatal, but it's not serious. And notice the way he did that. And part of this is Deacon Loris. He had a sense of humor, yes, but he's also saying something about his faith. So it's fatal. We're all going to die someday. And there's nothing to be afraid of. When we have faith, it's nothing to be afraid of. Because Deacon Loris, who had preached at so many funerals, he knew that death is not it's part of the end of life in this world, but more importantly, it's the beginning of the fullness of life in the world to come. And that's what he was living for all his life. Yeah, he had grown children, he was married, had a wonderful life and a counseling practice. And death came earlier than he expected, but he did expect it someday. And so this is the day. It's fatal, but not serious. You know, I really, that stuck with me, obviously. Judgment, death and judgment. Judgment, we will all be accountable for our actions. That is, we're accountable for how we have made use of the precious gift of life that God has given us. Each of us gets one life. How we choose to use it is up to us. It's up to our parents for a while, and then eventually it becomes up to us, what we do with this life. Jesus tells a parable about this, about the end of time and the final judgment, and he describes it as a shepherd separating sheep from goats. And he tells in the parable, I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. And then people ask, when did we see you hungry and feed you? When did we see you thirsty? When did we see you in any need and help you? He replied, as often as you did it for the least of my brothers and sisters, you did it for me. We can all get that. Okay, that reminds us that Christ is in everybody. But the second part, we usually don't read the gospel all the way through, because then he says, I was hungry and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me nothing. When did we see you hungry or thirsty and not care for you? As often as you failed to do it for the least of my brothers and sisters, you failed to do it for me. I don't know about you, but that line is what gets my attention. It forces a question in my heart. Where am I failing to love? Where am I failing to love a person in my life, or maybe a group of people, or some aspect, where am I holding my heart back and failing to act on that love? Because I know I will be accountable for that. And I need to confess that. And I need to change that in my life. If I call myself a disciple, I need to pay attention. Death and judgment. Heaven and hell. Well, I'll start with hell because I want to end on a positive note. Some people I've heard it said, and actually some have said this to me, that I don't believe in hell. If God's all loving, how can there be a hell? I get that way of thinking. But here are two main reasons why we need to believe in hell. First, and this is really the only reason we should need, Jesus believes in hell. He spoke about hell. He warned against hell. He cautioned us to be attentive of the reality of hell. And we need to live our lives in accordance that we're on our path to heaven and to avoid the things. That's why he told a parable like this. You failed to do it for the least of my brothers and sisters. You failed me. That's why he would tell a parable like that. So if we think, well, I don't know if I believe in that. Who do I think I am that I can say Jesus doesn't really know what he's talking about? It's a ridiculous notion. Jesus is divine revelation. And divine revelation is revealing truth to us that we need to pay attention to. But here's another reason to accept the notion of hell. It's a conclusion. It's one of the conclusions of having free will. We're not forced to love God. We're not forced to be in union with God. It's not necessarily a default. We're given choices. And when you have a choice, that means we can also choose to be distant from God or want to have nothing to do with God. That's why they say God doesn't really send anybody to hell. They choose to go there themselves because of the choices that they make. They choose, if they don't want to have a thing to do with God, God will honor their request. He's not going to force us to love him or to worship him or to praise him or to serve him. But here's where I find a lot of consolation for especially people I know or care about who seem to have distanced themselves from God. The consolation is that God is all merciful And he is merciful because he's all-knowing. What that means is he knows their hearts in ways that none of us can see. Sometimes people reject God, and what they're rejecting is a false notion of God. They don't really understand God's goodness. But sometimes they're rejecting a false notion. It is possible to have free will and make that choice, but some are confused about what God is and what God's plan is for us. And they just can't see it. That's why God can be so merciful and why we always pray for our faithful departed. In fact, it's even more important to pray for people who seem to be distant from God. That's why this month of All Souls is so important for us to offer our prayers for them. Heaven. Well, now this is our ultimate goal. Heaven is our destiny. But not just for me. It's not just my goal to get me into heaven. It's bigger than that. It's broader than that, I should say. It's our mission to also help lead people to heaven. In fact, the goal in life for married couples is to help get their spouses to heaven. The goal in life for parents is to help get their children to heaven. The goal of life for priests is to help get our parishioners to heaven. That's why we're talking about this stuff. It's our job. We should be conscious of our ultimate goal. The goal of true friendship is to help get our friends to heaven, to know Christ, to know that they're loved, to know that there is hope. And the ultimate goal of our parish and school and the universal church is to help those with whom we might have any influence at all to get to heaven. This is why the church exists. This is why the church exists. But it's a lifelong journey that begins now. Staying close to Jesus, our Savior, through the sacraments, through the scriptures, through prayer, through service to the least of the brothers and sisters of Christ, right? These are among the many ways in which we journey towards heaven. But it's not just the churchy ways, it's also in so-called secular world. Everywhere we go, God is still present there, and God is still calling us to be lights of hope that help lead people to heaven in some small way. So may we always remain faithful to Christ, but may we also have the confidence that Jesus will give us all that we need to stay on that path. He's always providing those avenues for us, the avenues for salvation. That's his passion, death, and resurrection, what we celebrate at this Mass, hear about in the Scriptures, to remain faithful and close to him in this world and in the world to come.